Hey class, Mr. Hanji here. For today's lesson, we're going to be taking a look at section 4.3, which is going to deal with modeling with arithmetic sequences. Now, before we get into our lesson for today, one quick note, section 4.3 is the last section for module 4, which means that you have a quiz upcoming. So 4.3 is our last section of module 4. Be on the lookout for a quiz soon. All right, so with that said, let's go ahead and get into our lesson for today. We have one learning goal today, and that learning goal is you will be able to model real-world problems using arithmetic sequences. So we're going to use arithmetic sequences to model or solve real-world situations or problems. All right, so with that said, let's go ahead and get into our lesson for today. And today we're actually going to jump right into example 1 for our work. So let's go ahead and move this up. Let's just focus on example 1. So example 1 asks us, answer the following questions relating to the rule for the arithmetic sequence. Now for part A, they say a telemarketer makes 82 calls per day. The total number of calls made over time in days is given by the function c of t equals 82t. So we're going to use this situation, and we're going to go through and answer the following different parts based off the arithmetic sequence and situation. All right, for part A, they ask us to complete the table of values for 4 days of calls. So to complete the table, we're going to take our function, which is c of t equals 82t. We're going to take that function, and we're going to use our values of 1, 2, 3, and 4, and plug them in for t to figure out the number of calls that are made each day. Now, 82t means that it's 82 times t. So we're going to do 82 times 1, 82 times 2, 82 times 3, and then 82 times 4. So we're going to go ahead and figure those out. So I'm going to go ahead and calculate them. So if we do 82 times 1, we get 82. 82 times 2, we get 164. 82 times 3, it's 246, and then 82 times 4 is going to be 328. So that means for 1, it's 82, 2 is 164, 3 is 246, and 4 is going to be 328. All right, and that is all that I have to do for part A, just because it asked me to complete the table, and we have completed the table. Now for part B, it wants us to determine the common difference. So the common difference is how much we're adding or subtracting to each term to get to the next term. So if we look at our table here, remember if you cannot visually see or right off the top of your head figure out what it is, just use your calculator. You're going to take the second term, which in this case is 164, and you're going to subtract it by the first term, which is 82. So we're going to do 164 minus 82, and we end up with 82. So that means my common difference in this situation is 82. Now, all that part wants me to figure out is what my common difference is, which we just figured out was 82. And that 82 represents that every day, 82 calls are made. So I have figured out my common difference, and that is all that it asked me to do for part B. Now for part C, it wants to know what do the variables represent, and then what are the reasonable domain and range values for this situation. So let's first take a look at what the variables represent. Out of our function, we have c and t. So we need to define what c and t represent out of this equation. Now, c represents the total number of calls made over time. So c equals total number of calls. And then t, which is time, in days. All right, so I have successfully gone through and defined what my variables represent in this situation. Now, for the second part of this, it wants me to state what are reasonable domain and range values for this situation. Now, in the past, or sometimes in the past, we've gone through and listed domain and range values. Remember, domain is x, so it'd be 1, 2, 3, and 4. Range is y, so it'd be 82, 164, 246, and 328. But that would be if they wanted to know for this table, but they want to know it for this situation. So let's kind of talk about something real quick. In terms of time, can I have negative amount of days? I can't have negative 2 days. Okay, you can only have 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on days. Can I make a negative number of calls? No. So I cannot make negative number of calls or negative amount of days. So we're just going to say that it's going to be all positive integers. Okay, integers just means numbers. And we're looking at positive because I cannot have a negative number of days or calls that can be made. So positive integers is going to be my reasonable domain and range values. Okay, so that is it for example 1. You're going to see a couple of problems like that, so I just wanted you to see how to fill in the table, how to identify your common difference, what the variables represent, and then what reasonable domain and range is. Okay, next we're going to take a look at example 2. Let me go ahead and slide this on up. All right, example 2 is going to ask us to construct an explicit rule in function notation for the arithmetic sequence represented in the table. Then determine the value of the given term and explain what it means. So, first of all, it wants us to go through and write an explicit rule. If you think back to 4.1 and 4.2, an explicit rule is f of n equals the first term plus or minus whatever our common difference is times n minus 1. We're not doing recursive, so there's not that f of n minus 1. That is not involved here. All right, for part A, Darnell starts saving the same amount from each week's paycheck. The table shows the total balance, f of n, of his savings account over time in weeks. So each week, Darnell saves a certain amount and he puts it in his savings account. Now, we have time in weeks n, which is 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then the balance of the savings account, which is 250, 380, 510, and 640. Now, when we did this in 4.2, remember I wanted you to go through and identify the first term, and then also identify what the common difference is. So let's first figure out what our first term is. Our first term, based off the table, is 250. And then how much is this increasing or decreasing by? So how much do I have to add to 250 to get to 380? Again, for common difference, if you're struggling to figure it out, just use your calculator. You take your second term, 380, and you subtract it by your first term, which is 250. and we're increasing in this problem by 130. So each time I'm adding 130, so that means each week Darnell is saving $130. Okay, so with that said, we can now go through and write my explicit rule. If I am writing my explicit rule for this situation, and I'm going to kind of separate this here, my explicit rule would be f of n equals, we're going to take the first term, which is 250. We're going to add our common difference, so 130 times n minus 1. All right, so I've gone through and constructed my explicit rule. From here, I then just need to go through and finish answering. So this wants us to go through and determine the value of f of 9 and explain what it represents in this situation. So that means I'm going to plug 9 in for n and go through and solve. So if I plug in 9, so we have f of 9 equals 250 plus 130 times 9 minus 1. So we're going to have 250 plus 130 times 9 minus 1, or 8. So we're going to do 130 times 8 plus 250. So if we go through and set this up, we're going to do 250 plus 130 times parentheses 9 minus 1. So that's going to give us 8, and then it's going to do 130 times 8, and then add it to 250. So my ninth term in this situation is going to be 1290. And then the last part wants us to go through and state what that means in this situation. Well, this 1290 means after 9 weeks, Darnell will have saved $1,290. Let me see if I can get this in here. So after nine weeks, he has $1,290. So that is going to be what this ninth term represents in this situation. So when I plug 9 in, we got 1290. So that means after 9 weeks, Darnell has $1,290 in his savings account. All right, so if you see anything like example 2, it wants you to go through and construct an explicit rule. So you're going to figure out your first term, your common difference, write your explicit rule, plug in or determine the value of whatever term they want you to figure it out, and then explain what it means in that situation. Okay, so that is part A. Part B, kind of go through and with it, I will run through this problem with you guys as well, and just to kind of give you guys more exposure to this. All right, so for part B, we need to do the same thing. Write an explicit rule, and then go through and figure it out for a specific term. So 1 is traveling to visit universities. He notices mile markers along the road. He records the mile markers for every 10 miles. His father is driving at a constant speed. Complete the table and then answer it for part B. So for part A, we need to go through and complete the table. So they tell us for time interval 1 that it's 520. The next one is 509 and then 598. So we need to figure out how much this is increasing or decreasing by to figure out our common difference so we can fill in the rest of the table. So again, we're going to take the second number in our table, which is 509, and we're going to subtract it by the first number, which is 520. So if I do 509 minus 520, we get negative 11. So that means I'm subtracting 11 each time. So we're subtracting 11 each time to get to my next number, or my next term, sorry. So to figure out my other parts, we're going to take 489 and we're going to subtract it by 11. So 498, sorry. 498 minus 11, that's going to give me 487. Then we're going to subtract by 11, and we get 476. Subtract by 11 again, and we end up with 465 for the mile marker. All right, so we've completed the table for part A. Now for part B, it wants us to find f of 10 and then tell what it represents in this situation. So if we're going through and writing our explicit rule, our first term is 520, and we discovered our common difference is negative 11. So if I'm writing my explicit rule for this, it's f of n equals, again, first term, so 520, plus or minus our common difference. This is negative 11, so it's going to be minus 11 times n minus 1. So that is my explicit rule. Now, the next thing it wants me to do is go through and find the 10th term. So we're going to go through and plug 10 in. So we're going to do f of 10 equals 520 minus 11 times 10 minus 1. So we're going to plug this into our calculator. So it's 520 minus 11 times 10 minus 1. So it's going to do that 10 minus 1, which gives us 9. Multiply it by 11, and then you do 520 minus that. So we do 520 minus 11 times, so parentheses 10 minus 1, end parenthesis, and we end up with 421 for our 10th term. So our 10th term is 421, and this 421 means after 10 time intervals, they are at mile marker 421. So to kind of write that out, so what I'm writing is at the 10 time interval, they are at mile marker 421. And that is our answer for example 2B. So again, go through and figure out what your first term is, your common difference, write your explicit rule, plug in for whatever term they want you to find, and then just state what it means in that situation. Okay, so that is it for example 2. Now we have 2 more examples yet to go, and it's kind of running through similar stuff, but just different situations, and they look a little different. So let's go ahead and take a look at example 3. All right, for example 3, they want us to go through and construct an explicit rule and function notation for the arithmetic sequence represented in the graph, then determine the value of the given term and explain what it means. So we're doing the same thing we did in example 2, it's just instead of having a table, we are given a graph. So we're going to do the same thing where we're going to go through and write an explicit rule, and then with that explicit rule, we're going to go through and figure out for the 12th term. So Ed collects autographs. The graph shows the total number of autographs that Ed has collected over time in weeks. So they want us to find f of 12 and explain what it represents. So this is the same thing we did in example 2. Figure out your first term, figure out your common difference, write the explicit rule, and then plug the number in. So let's take a look at our graph. Looking at our graph, what is our first term? Well, the first point is at 1, 20. So that means our first term, f of 1, is at 20. The next step is to figure out our common difference. So we have to figure out how much it's being added or subtracted by. So from 20 to 35, what did I have to add to 20 to get to 35? So 20 plus what equals 35? In this case, we have added 15. So that means my common difference is 15. So if I'm going through and writing my explicit rule, f of n is going to equal, again, it's my first term, so 20, plus my common difference times n minus 1. So this is my explicit rule that I'm going to use to then figure out the 12th term and explain what it means. Now, to figure out the 12th term, we're going to plug 12n for n into this situation. So we're going to have f of 12 equals 20 plus 15 times 12 minus 1. Now, by this point, because I've done it for part A and part B in example 2, I think you should be able to use your calculator to go through and figure out what the 12th term is, and then describe what it means in this situation. So whenever you figure out the 12th term, let's say it's 185, that means in 12 weeks he has 185 autographs. So I'll leave this for you to go through and finish. Again, you just have to go through and figure out what your 12th term is, plug it into your calculator, and then explain what it means. So I'm going to leave that for you. You can look at my completed notes to see if you are correct. All right, so part B of example 3 is the same idea, just different situation and another table. If we look at part B, it states Bob purchased a bus pass card with 320 points. Each week costs 20 points for unlimited bus rides. The graph shows the points remaining on the card over time in weeks. It wants us to determine the value of f of 10, so the 10th term, and explain what it means. So again, same thing. You're going to use your graph to figure out the first term and the common difference, then write your explicit rule, and then figure it out for the 10th term and explain what it means. So let's go ahead and figure out our first term. Looking at our graph, our first point is at 1, 300. So that means our first term is 300. All right, next, we need to go through and figure out our common difference. So we have to ask ourselves, what do I need to add or subtract to 300 to get to 280? So what, because this is going down, we're subtracting, 300 minus what equals 280? In this case, it's 20. So that means my common difference is negative 20. If you're struggling to figure out what this is, again, take your second term, 280, and subtract it by your first term, which is 300. So now that I have my first term and my common difference, my explicit rule is f of n equals 300 minus 20 times n minus 1. Now, like with part A, I'm going to leave the rest of this problem for you. you're going to go through and plug 10 in for n. So you're going to have f of 10 equals 300 minus 20 times 10 minus 1. So go through and plug 10 in for n, figure out your 10th term, and then explain what it means. Now, in this case, once you figured out your 10th term, that represents after 10 weeks, Bob has that amount remaining on his card for points. Okay, so that is it for example 3. So example 3 is the same thing as example 2. It's just you have a graph instead of a table. Now, example 4 is going to be a little bit different, and I kind of want to talk about these real quick. So example 4 is going to ask us, construct an explicit rule in function notation for the arithmetic sequence, then determine the value of the given term and explains what it means. So same idea as we have done in example 2 and in example 3, just we do not have a table, we do not have a graph, yet we are given a situation. So for example 4, part A, to package and ship an item, it costs $5.75 for the first pound and 75 cents for each additional pound. Find the 12th term and explain what it represents. So the first pound is going to represent or cost $5.75. Because we're talking about the first pound, that represents our first term. So our first term in this problem is 5.75. So the first pound is 500. Oh my goodness, I keep saying it. The first pound cost $5.75. So my first term is 5.75. Now my common difference is how much it costs for each additional pound, which is 0.75. So that means my common difference is 0.75. So first pound is 5.75. My common difference is each additional pound is 75 cents. So now that I have figured out my first term and my common difference, we're going to go through and write our explicit rule, which is going to be f of n equals, start with your first term, so 5.75, plus your common difference, so 0.75, and then n minus 1. So this is my explicit rule for this situation. They want us to find the 12th term and explain what it means. So we're going to plug 12n for n. So we're going to have 5.75 plus 0.75 times 12 minus 1. Now, if you go through and plug that into your calculator, which I think you should feel fairly good about doing, our 12th term, if you want to double check, is going to be 14. So I've thus answered what my 12th term is. It then wants me to go through and explain what that represents. So talking about the 12th term means it cost $14. I'm going to change color. So it cost $14 to ship a 12-pound package. So at 12 pounds, it's going to cost $14 to ship that package. And that is our answer for example 4A. Now, I do want to run through example 4B because you're going to see it on your homework, but I also want to give you a representation of what this looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and move this on up here. If I can get this to straighten out here. There we go. We'll cover up the previous problem. All right, for part B, it states Carrie borrows $960 interest-free to pay for a car repair. She will repay $120 monthly until the loan is paid off. How many months will it take Carrie to pay off the loan? Explain. So, for this situation, we have Carrie borrows $960, and each month she repays $120. Now, initial instinct for this problem is to say that your f of 1 is 960. That would not be the case for this. She initially borrows 960, but in the first month, that's not what her remaining balance is. Okay, first month, she would have made a payment of 120. So I'm going to call this my f of 0. My 0 point is 960. So that's what the initial starting point was. If she makes her first monthly payment, which is 120, so we're going to subtract 120 because she borrowed, so she owes 960, she pays back 120, so we have to take away my first month remaining balance. If I do 960 minus 120 is 840. So my first term in the sequence is actually 840. 960 is not, because that's how much she initially borrowed. We want to know after the first month. We don't care about the initial, we care about the first term. The first term is going to be 840. And then we figured out our common difference is negative 120. So now using this, I can then go through and create my explicit rule, which is f of n equals 840 minus 120 times n minus 1. Okay, so I now have my explicit rule for this situation. Now let's take a look at the other part. So how many months will it take Carrie to pay off the loan? So notice it's not actually asking us after f of n, what term they want us to find. So they're not saying f of 7, figure out what the value is. They want us to know when it's completely paid off. So completely paid off is when this is going to equal 0. So we need to figure out for how many months does it take for the remaining balance to be 0. Now, a couple of ways you could do this is you can just plug in numbers for n. So you could plug in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 until you get to 0. Or I can go through and plug 0n for f of n and set it equal to 840 minus 120 times n minus 1. Again, the reason why I'm plugging 0n for f of n is because it wants to know how many months it will take Carrie to pay off the loan, which would mean it would be at 0, so this is how much is remaining. So we want to make that 0. And again, because they're not asking me what is, or determine the value of f of 7. Because there's nothing about f of 7 or f of whatever term, I don't know what term to plug in, so we need to figure it out. So your first step in solving this is to go through and distribute this negative 120 to n and negative 1. So when I go through and distribute, we get 0 equals 840 minus 120n, and then negative 120 times negative 1 is positive 120. Now, before I finish going through and solving for this problem, we need to combine our like terms, which is 840 and 120. 840 plus 120 is going to be 960 minus 120n. If I were to move this 120n over because it's negative, okay, I'm going to add 120n over, so I get 120n equals 960. At this point, you should feel comfortable in solving, where to get n alone, you have to divide by 120. And if I do 960, keep moving the paper, if I do 960 divided by 120, I get n to equal 8. So that means it will take 8 months for Carrie to pay off the loan. And that is my answer for example 4b. So that should help you with a question that's going to pop up on the homework. I wanted to give you an example of something that's a little different. Understand 90 to 95% of what you're doing is like example 4a or example 2 or example 3. Figure out your first term, figure out your common difference, write your explicit rule using that. Then it wants you to find for a certain term. So you're going to plug that number in and figure out what your term is for whatever they ask you. All right, so with that said, that is your lesson for section 4.3 on modeling with arithmetic sequences. That is it for your video. If you have any questions or need help with anything, just let me know or ask next time you see me or shoot me an email. Be sure to use the completed notes as a reference and a guide as you do your homework. And otherwise, that is it for today. I hope you have a great day. Thank you for listening. And remember, 4.3 is the last section of Module 4, so expect a quiz to be upcoming. But otherwise, that is all that I have for you guys today. Have a great day, and I will talk to you guys later. All right, bye.